Phumlani Josie, the author of Lessons from Past Heroes. I'm back on the show this week to talk the government debt and inflation with Russell Lamberti. He is an executive director and economist at Sakeliga. I've known him for a while, for years, Russell. Russell is one of those economists who tell it as it is. And I like economists like that. I don't like economists who like political correctness. Russell, how are you? Are you good?
Yes, Phumlani, I'm well. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here. I'm looking forward to getting into some of the numbers today. So yeah, let's have a good discussion.
Yeah,
Great to be on your.
yeah, awesome, awesome, man. What do you make of this week's inflation numbers, right? Inflation up last month to 3.5% from 3% in June. Um, and that's highest in about, what, 10, 11 months. What's going on with this inflation that we've seen spiking last month?
Yeah, look, Phumlani, it's always difficult to pinpoint exactly what's going on with short-term movements in inflation. I think
Yes.
always good to keep in mind the big picture. So remember, we had a very high rate of inflation following the lockdowns, and that was because Economics 101, we shut down supply, governments shut down supply. So you reduce supply and they increase the money supply substantially, especially overseas, but certainly in South Africa as well. So if you've got more money supply circulating and transacting, and you've got fewer goods and services, you're going to get a big spike in inflation. And that's what we saw with a lag coming through 2021, 2022. But what did we then see? We then saw that central banks did not carry on with those loose monetary policies, and bank credit expansion was remained very limited. The Reserve Bank raised interest rates substantially. Banks found it very difficult to extend credit. The economies are, not going very well. There's very poor growth. So it's not like people are just willing to borrow more and more. People are actually saturated with debt. They're struggling. So bank credit expansion, which is another way that the money supply grows, has been very slow.
Mm,
And after the lockdowns, you've seen a big recovery in production. People got back to work. People started
yeah.
producing things. And so the supply of things goes up. And so actually that's what caused inflation to go from around 8% a year, which is high inflation rate, all the way down to about 3%, which is historically on the low end of inflation for South Africa. I personally still think it's too high. And it's been quite interesting to note Lesetja Kganyago, the Reserve Bank governor, um, advocating for a lower inflation target. I think that's very wise. I think that's a good move. It's going to come against opposition. It's going to be considered controversial, but I think that's a good thing. So I don't think in the Reserve Bank's mind, they are seeing 3.5% as low inflation
Yeah.
in relation to the 3 to 6% target band.
Target,
If
yeah.
you think 3 to 6% is the target band, you would consider 3% low. But I don't think that that's how the Reserve Bank is seeing inflation. I think they would like to target maybe something more like a 2 to 4% level, in which case inflation is sort of currently in the right zone for them. Now, there's all sorts of questions and debates we can have around how accurate is the CPI? Do people really believe that prices have only gone up by 3%
That's a
year on
good
year?
point, Russell. Sorry to interject. Because many people, Russell, when you put out these numbers, economists like you, they when you put out these inflation numbers, well, inflation is low, it's within the target band. People are saying, look, when I go to the shopping center, I just feel things are expensive. So I mean, how do we balance
Exactly.
this, the statistics and people's experience?
Yeah, no, it's a very tricky area. To be
Yeah.
honest, I think a whole major piece of academic work could and should be done about this. And look, it has been to some degree, but I think this is a PhD thesis waiting for someone. So if there's some students out there really getting to the bottom of um, the official statistics and how, and I'm not even talking about some conspiracy to keep
Mm,
inflation rates low. there are certain biases, inbuilt biases that emerge when you're measuring a vast number of goods and you're continuously changing the basket for consumer patterns and so on, versus simply taking very simple baskets year on year. If you ask someone to go to the shops, Pick and Pay or Woolworths or Checkers, wherever they shop, and put 20 or 30 items in their trolley or their basket that are consistent, and you compare it to last year, I think it's very difficult to make the case that that basket is only 3% more expensive than it was last year.
Yeah.
That's very unlikely, and a lot of people would say it's wrong. Now, of course, there are certain things in the broader consumer basket that sometimes fall in price. Sometimes petrol was 24 Rand last year, now it's 22 Rand this year. That's a fairly sizable reduction. People spend a lot of money on petrol. So, there are certain things that you have to take into account. It's not just grocery shopping and what have you, but there is something here because I think that most people would say, and I think most workers would say, most people who earn wages and salaries, that if you just were getting a 3% salary increase now, it's very unlikely that that is compensating you for for the changes in your cost of living. It's very unlikely. And I think most people intuitively understand that. So this is a big area of analysis and study that needs to be done. It's not an easy one. It's a riddle. It's a paradox that has to be solved. Because if you went out and as you rightly say, if you interviewed most people out there, they will there's no way that they will agree that prices are only up by 3%. Now, they could be wrong, but I think if you interviewed a crowd of people, if you did a 2,000 people interview, you would probably start getting a sense of what they call the wisdom of crowds as people estimate what they think their cost of living has gone up. And I'd be very surprised if it was only 3%.
Now, just sort of two questions, but we can answer them in one, I guess, as we close off the inflation discussion. Um, the central bankers during COVID and just after COVID, right? Well, we could say during COVID was you've already said this that really the economies were shut down, and then there was money, being flooded in economies by central bankers. Was that the right response to COVID, in your view, briefly? And then the second question will be your thoughts on Lesetja Kganyago, our current governor of the Reserve Bank. Do you think he has been rational in his monetary policy, in his governance of our Reserve Bank? Has he got inflation right? Is he one of the right leaders we have when it comes to our monetary policy? Your thoughts on those two
Phumlani,
topics?
yeah,
Yeah,
Phumlani, I think that the lockdowns were a travesty. I really think that they were one of the largest policy mistakes that we've seen, certainly in our lifetime, and really perhaps ever.
yeah,
They were a global travesty of a policy. Um, they've led to tens of millions of job losses around the world. They've led to tremendous economic hardship, and that hardship is not just a statistic. It has very, very real implications on quality of life, healthcare,
mm,
crime and violence, all kinds of societal problems. So what we're dealing with in the wake of that event is very, very substantial. Now, of course, things do recover, but they take a long time. They take longer than people think, very often. And they don't recover in the way that you necessarily expect. And so there's a lot of people who are still actually suffering economically as a result of the wealth destruction that we saw back then. So I think the lockdowns were a tremendous
yeah,
mistake. Not just economically. I happen to be one of those who don't believe that they helped in any way from a public health perspective as well.
yes,
Um,
yeah,
Now, the second big mistake that was made during that time was the huge printing of money. All that does ultimately is devalue the currency and steal value from people who are holding currency. That's what inflation does. It robs little bits of value from everyone in the economy and channels it towards whoever's getting the newly printed money, whether it was business subsidies, whether it was mostly it was, a lot of it was actually funneled into government expenditures, but some of it was given to people to keep their incomes flowing. And that might have been seen to be a humane thing to do, given that you had locked everyone down. So it was ultimately, this is a good example of bad policies begetting more bad policies. So that's that. Now, when it comes to South African Central Bank, ironically, as opposed to the lockdown, where South Africa had one of the most stringent lockdowns in the entire world for a population that could least afford it, our central bank actually, all things considered, had one of the better monetary policy responses in the world. We were not so reckless as the Federal Reserve and as many of these other central banks. And subsequently, in the face of the inflation that then emerged, the central bank raised interest rates and has kept interest rates what some people consider stubbornly high, but what I think is probably an appropriate level given the overall lack of savings and lack of capital in the country. Ultimately, interest rates need to be at those sorts of levels to encourage more savings. Savings is what fuels and funds growth, not overspending, reckless spending. So, all things considered, I actually think that the Reserve Bank has done a reasonable job. That's one of the reasons, by the way, why the rand, the exchange rate, most people think it's very weak, but many people would have expected it over the last 10 years to become much weaker than it is.
Oh,
So the
yeah.
rand
Okay.
the rand is subject to competing forces. Number one is the mismanagement of the economy by the government, and that should weaken the currency. But number two is the relatively prudent management of monetary policy by the SARB, and that's a counterbalancing force that kind of keeps the rand reasonably stable. So if you look at the last 3 years, the rand's kind of been going sideways against the dollar, against most major currencies,
Yeah.
at a time when you might have thought it actually should have been weakening more. So that's a credit, I think, to the Reserve Bank. And so overall, I think Mr. Kganyago has done a reasonable job, Phumlani. Yeah.
So he's one of the good guys in South Africa. Yeah, yeah. No, I also think highly of him. I think he's one of the better guys, in our
People criticize the central banks for keeping interest rates high. We're even seeing this in America. The Treasury Department and the president himself in America are criticizing Mr. Powell, the Federal Reserve Chairman, for not cutting interest rates.
yeah.
And people are criticizing Mr. Kganyago for not cutting interest rates. And the problem with these criticisms is that people think that lower interest rates is what creates better growth. And that's simply not true. What you can get if you cut interest rates very quickly and very dramatically is you can get a bubble type economy. You can get a very short term boom type situation happening. It's easier to borrow, it's easier to finance certain things, but that is likely to end in tears. That is not where strong, sustainable, long term growth actually comes from. Rather, that kind of growth comes from high rates of saving and deregulation, which is perhaps an issue that we can get into somewhat in this conversation, because South Africa is a very, very highly regulated economy.
Yeah. I hold the same opinion as you, Russell, that I've never seen our problems as problems that need to be that will be addressed by our monetary policy. I've seen it as problems of governance, problems of sky high crime, problems of bad education that is not globally competitive, problems of high levels of regulation, problems of high tax rates that are anti-growth. I've seen it as those are the problems, right? If we have things like
Very,
black economic empowerment that drives
very
away
much so.
investment, how is that?
Very much so.
Yeah,
Yeah, people like to scapegoat monetary policy because it seems like an easy fix.
yeah,
One committee just has to make a few decisions on interest rates and then suddenly think that that's
we
not
all
how it works.
prosper. Yeah.
That's not how it works at all. Last point on this from a monetary policy perspective is it's useful for people to think of it like this. Monetary policy can't really help an economy, but it certainly can harm an economy.
Ah,
So if you are managing monetary policy correctly, then it's up to, as you said, regulations, um, fiscal policy, industrial
mm,
policy, and so on. But you can mismanage monetary policy and do harm. And you do that when you create boom and bust cycles, when you allow money and credit growth to be way faster than is sustainable or healthy, when you use monetary policy to create inflation, which really just harms the holders of currency. It harms poor people. It distorts decision making in the economy. All these sorts of problems. So, at best, monetary policy can hold things stable enough that gives a platform for businesses to grow in a stable monetary environment, an environment of predictable prices where people can get on and build value and create value. But if
yeah.
the regulatory environment is restrictive, you can do whatever you like with monetary policy. You're not going to get the growth that you want.
Ah, I think that's a very, very important point to the likes of Kosatu and others, who
Yeah.
complain that the
So,
interest rates are high. Now let's move to the government debt, Russell. So right now we are at about 77, 76%, debt to GDP ratio. I'm not sure I couldn't check the stabilization targets for the treasury in the next few years or so. Um, and how do you see our debt? Because I was looking at the BRICS nation, China is at about 88%, right? Of this is debt to GDP ratio. India is at 81%. Brazil is at 84%. And then we have Russia, which is 20%. This is debt to GDP ratio. So we are not too different from those countries. But I mean, should we be concerned about our government debt? Well, some people say, well, it's not really a big deal so long as we borrow to spend wisely. Where we are right now, should we be concerned? How do you see our debt?
we should be very, very concerned, Phumlani. Firstly, even the best governments in the world generally spend on relatively unproductive um,
Programs.
things.
Yeah.
Um, but we know that the South African government is one of the most wasteful, um, one of the most wasteful and corrupt governments in the world. Um, and so the enormous amounts of borrowing that this government is doing every year, being funded by who? By banks, pension funds, foreign pension funds. These are the sorts of entities that are lending money to this government every year for it to spend unproductively.
Mm,
It's an incredible thing when you think about it. These serious financial institutions continue to fund an operation that is running an enormous deficit every year. Currently, the deficit is in the 350 billion rand a year zone, which means that in 3 years, which is what the Treasury calls the medium term expenditure period, which is a 3 year period, means in 3 years, you're incurring an additional 1 trillion rand of new debt.
mm,
Okay. Now, what does that mean? What does that mean for people? Number one, it means that the interest payments on that debt, okay, because you've got to service those debts with interest for the people who lent you that money. So the interest
yeah.
payments are rising substantially. Where does that interest come from? It comes from your and my taxes. Okay. So money that's being taxed can't now be spent on police. It can't be spent on education. It can't be spent on state hospitals. It has to go to these interest payments. That's now coming rising over 400 billion rand a year. And that's going to hit 500 billion rand a year in the next few years. Half a trillion rand a year in the next few years just on interest payments.
Yeah.
Okay. So um, so you can see that that's one considerable effect. Another huge effect of this is that these debts can only be paid back in the long run by taxes remaining high, and by taxing future generations. Okay, so
Yes.
the,
Young
the
people
government,
in future.
yeah, so the government is taking on these debt obligations on behalf of young people who never asked for it. They didn't ask for those debt obligations, and they're doing it anyway. And so this is why excessive fiscal deficits and national debt builds up tremendous problems politically, socially, and economically in the long run. And one of the great problems of this is that it's in no one's, very few people's best interests in terms of the politicians and the leaders to fix it now. It's always easier to push the problem into the future, to keep pushing the problem into the future. And so, unfortunately, South Africa sits with around about 6 trillion rand of government debt. It also sits with an enormous amount of what's called contingent liabilities. And that's a fancy term for government guaranteeing the debts of other entities like Eskom, Transnet,
Wow. Mm,
Denel. Um, uh, it's even guaranteed the debts of independent power producers,
mm.
and so on and so forth. The Road Accident Fund is one of those contingent liabilities. When you add all of that up, you add about another 1 trillion rand of potential obligations that the government has.
Yeah.
And if those entities fail, creditors are expecting the central government to make good on those debts. And so you could argue a certain way of looking at these things is that the overall debt is closer to something like 100% of GDP.
Mm,
Uh, Now, that's just a statistic. What does 100% mean? Because some countries have 200% debt to GDP levels. Some only have 100. Well, what really matters is whether you can service that debt without crippling the entire apparatus of state. And that's becoming a big challenge in South Africa. Um, and and the degree to which investors, the people who are continuing to lend all this money, maintain confidence in the ability of this entire system to pay them back and to service those loans. And
yeah.
those factors are not hard and fast mathematical factors. They are much more related to, yes, finance, and yes, maths, and yes, the numbers, but also to sentiment, to confidence, to fear. All these kinds of things are wrapped up in this. And so right now, people are continuing to lend to the South African government, but there can come a point where investors start losing confidence, where investors start to believe that actually that they cannot lend any more money to a wasteful government. They're going to realize that they need to start pulling back on that lending activity, and that then starts to create problems for the government because they can't sell their bonds anymore so easily, so they have to make it more attractive to
Yes.
buy their bonds. The way you do that is you have to offer higher interest rates. But if you're offering higher interest rates, your interest payments go up and they go higher. And this is when people talk about a debt trap or a fiscal cliff or these sorts of things, it's the way that this can evolve and start to run away from you a little bit. Interest payments go up. So you now need to spend more and borrow more, and you can get into a really vicious cycle. Now, I don't think this is necessarily immediately around the corner for South Africa, but it could honestly go in a very bad direction very, very quickly. It could also take a number of years. But what is certain, Phumlani, is that the trajectory is certainly unsustainable and very worrying.
Very worrying. Now, there are people who say, Russell, I was speaking on another webinar a few months back. I was one of the speakers. There was one economist who was, discussing this issue of debt, government spending, and so on. And then he said that we shouldn't be we shouldn't worry about debt, right? We should worry more about growth. That the problem we have this very high or debt to GDP ratio that can be concerning is because we have low levels of growth. If we can push up economic growth, right now we are growing at less than 1%. We grow less than 1% over the past 10 years on average, which is not good. And if we can push to plus 3%, plus 4% growth, plus minus 5%, we could address the issue of debt. That the issue is economic growth. It's not debt, really. What's your response to that?
Very simple response. It's obviously both. It's obviously both.
Yeah.
Growth is important, but dealing with the debt is also extremely important. And they're actually very related because the way that the entire fiscus is set up, it's set up to require incredibly high rates of taxation. And that is one of the reasons why we are such a low growth economy. We are
Mm.
extremely heavily taxed. It's not just the regulations, there's a regulatory environment as well that's very, very harmful. But the rate of taxation is very, very high. Corporate tax, when you consider corporate tax and then dividend withholding taxes and so on, these essentially amount to about a 40% tax on corporations.
Yeah.
The top marginal tax rate is 45%. Average tax rates are anywhere from 25 to 35% for most people. This is, and of course, we know that for those taxes, you get very, very little in return because we have a
Exactly.
state that misallocates those
Very
resources.
sad. Yeah.
Yeah, that doesn't run the police properly, doesn't run schools properly, doesn't run healthcare properly. So people are in a sense double taxed because you're paying for taxes, but you're also paying for private schools, private security, private healthcare, all these other things. This is just an incredible dampener on growth. And the overspending by the state, not only does that require high taxes, but it also crowds out efficient private spending. Resources are scarce. And so when you are spending money like this, you are channeling resources to unproductive ends. And so these are really actually one and the same thing, Phumlani, fixing the deficit problem, fixing the addiction, the government's addiction to enormous amounts of spending, which is a very, very difficult problem to fix because it's
Mm.
political and it's very, very sticky. But that is hugely bound up with the growth story. So it's not just that you turn on some switch and you start getting good growth, and then it makes all this debt stuff not a huge problem. The debt issue, the deficit issue, the government spending issue is actually a major reason for the lack of growth.
Yeah. 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 Russell, I stay in a place that is expensive, at least for me, right, in Johannesburg. And it's partly because it's more secure, right, than where I
Mm.
was. Where I was before, I was hijacked. This was, I think it was end of 2021. I was hijacked when I was just driving through into the complex. And then it wasn't as secure as this area where I stay. So I have had to pay more, for my safety, right? If I was living in a
Yeah,
country where there was, where I felt where it was safe and no crime, I would have, I would be staying in a place that is lower in terms of cost, and maybe my cost of living wouldn't be as high as it is, especially when I'm paying all these taxes that I'm paying. It's quite unfortunate. And there are
great
many
point.
people, Russell, in South Africa who have to go through that. Basically, we are paying more for our safety to remain safe.
Correct.
Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. So this just shows you, I mean, that's just one way of describing, in a very concrete, personal way, what I've just been explaining, and it's a very powerful way because most people can relate,
Yeah.
Phumlani, to precisely what you're saying, and this just shows you the extremely negative consequences for society as a whole of this very wasteful government spending. Now, there are certain people that benefit from it. They get the salaries for doing very unproductive jobs. They
Mm,
sit on the state's payroll and they get pensions and they get salaries and all these sorts of things. Um, but ultimately, even their own paychecks that they're getting from the government don't carry them very far because they also want to live in safe environments.
yeah.
Just like you, just because they're a government employee doesn't mean they magically get to live in a low cost, safe environment. They also are looking for places that are much more secure. So their paychecks don't go very far. And they are now, because of this whole system, they are having to operate and be in an environment in a country that is low growth, low opportunity. So their children coming through school have fewer and fewer opportunities in the private sector. So that then drives more desire for people to be employed in the public sector. But the state cannot take on all these obligations. It can't hire everyone. Can only hire so many people. You
Mm,
have to have the wealth creators in society to produce the value for an entity like government to produce its administrative functions, which you and I both know, Phumlani, actually cost way less than is claimed. Okay, the government currently spends 30 something percent of GDP. You and I know as free market guys
mm.
that government can spend way, way, way less and still be just as effective.
Yes, absolutely. Mm,
There's an enormous amount of waste. So we are talking hundreds of billions every year, hundreds of billions of rands, maybe even a few trillion rand of just incredible wasted resources. And there's just no way that you can grow, that you can that you can produce value when you have an entity like the state, so big as it is, sucking value out of the out of the productive economy to the extent that it's doing. And we haven't even spoken about the regulatory environment yet. So
yeah.
even before you get to regulation, this is an incredible drain. Regulation then adds to it, and that's why we have a stagnant economy. You spoke about 1% growth. Probably it's more like zero. And
Yeah.
certainly when you
Yeah.
and certainly when you look at it on a per capita basis, per
Yeah.
person basis, the economy is not outgrowing the population. So on average, um, per capita GDP is pretty much going sideways or really falling slightly. Um, and that's because of there's a few factors. We haven't even spoken about the regulation, and that's the next huge issue. And that's a lot of what the work we do at Sakeliga is tackling these harmful regulations. It's not just race-based policy, although I think that is a major problem in the economy, but it's the degree to which the
Oh.
state wants to put its hands into all these productive areas. One of the big ones currently that's a long-term uh, problem. We've got to really resist this. Is the desire of the state to capture the healthcare system through the National Health Insurance uh,
Mm,
Act or the National Health Insurance Plan. That would see the virtual nationalization of healthcare in this country. It's another way in which the state wants to get its hands on a very dynamic and very productive sector, squeeze the life out of it, bend it according to the state's desires. And so there's a raft of very, very problematic regulations that have to be resisted for this economy to be able to experience meaningful growth.
meaningful growth. Yeah. Yeah. Now let's close off. We have 5 minutes left. Well, 4 minutes. Let's close off on them. We'll discuss regulation sometime in future in detail. Let's close off with the debt service costs, right? You mentioned them a bit earlier, and I bumped into something here. Um, I can't remember the source. I can't see the source of this, but it's one of the reputable organizations that compiled some data, right, on how South Africa spends its money. Top of the list in 2024 was servicing debt, and then basic education, right? In other words, at the top of our spending is debt service costs of 389 billion rands. Coming second after that is basic education. In third, is social protection, fourth is health, and then fifth is community development and other programs. But the main thing here, the highlight, of course, is that as we spend way more on debt service costs than in basic education, in social protection, in health, and so on. So debt service costs, and apparently we take about last time I checked, I think about was it 20% 21% of our tax revenues going to, we spend it in servicing the debt. That's
Yeah,
a lot. I mean,
it's
speak to that.
it's 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 an enormous amount. I'm not going to spend too long on this because I know we've got time constraints, but also you've essentially
Yeah,
laid it out there for people. But we are moving in the next few years to around about half a trillion, 500 billion rand a year in debt service costs. You're perfectly correct. We're approaching the 400 billion mark now. That's going to go up in the next few years. This, of course, just pulls resources away from other critical things. Um, there's only one last thing I'll say on this, and people can start trying to wrap their heads around this.
yeah.
You could argue that we're not actually paying it out of taxes. We're paying a lot of it out of new borrowing,
Mm,
and we borrow the government borrows, should I say, around about needs to borrow new close to 400 billion rand or 350 billion. That's the deficit, and that's roughly the interest burden. So, in essence, what's going on is that we are borrowing new money to service the interest on old debts. That is the definition of unsustainable. And
yeah,
so, in the coming years, this has to change, or else South Africa is on the road to a fiscal crisis,
yeah,
which ultimately has major bearing on the financial system and on the economy as a whole, at least for a while. Um,
yeah.
Going through a fiscal crisis is a major economic event, and it's very, very serious, and it's something that policymakers need to start taking very, very seriously. Fortunately, I think it's very, very difficult to get out of the unhealthy equilibrium that we're in now because politicians do not see an incentive to change this trajectory at the moment. And that's where we are right now. So it's a sobering message, Phumlani, but the more people can know about it and wrap their heads around it, the better.
The better. Russell Lamberti, great to talk to you, sir. The executive director and economist at Sakeliga, who does wonderful work, very much pro-market, loves individual freedom. I think we need more South Africans of that kind. Great to talk to you, sir, and thank you so much for your time.
Phumlani, thanks very much. Wonderful to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. It's Phumlani Majozi. We'll chat soon. You enjoyed this conversation? Well, if you did, do subscribe to this show, the Phumlani Majozi Show on Public Policy. Remember to also follow me on X at Phumlani M. Majozi. I'm also on LinkedIn, Phumlani M. Majozi. I'm on Instagram as well, at Phumlani M. Majozi. I'm also on Facebook, Phumlani M. Majozi. That's my Facebook page. I'm also on TikTok at Phumlani Majozi. If you have any recommendations or thoughts about this show, do email me, majozimedia@gmail.com. Yes, majozimedia@gmail.com.